Good morning. This is the press conference that I have before a legislative meeting, and tomorrow, June 28th, will be a legislative meeting. And although it's June 28th, it will be the regular meeting that we would ordinarily have the first Tuesday in July, the first Tuesday of the month. That Tuesday would be July 5th, and we will have an additional meeting on July 12th. So there are two meetings before the council recess. Bills are starting to come out of committees based on now that we're done with the budget. And so we're seeing more action, although I don't know that there's a lot that's controversial with regard to tomorrow's legislative meeting. There may be some amendments regarding the non-compete clarification amendment act that was reported out of the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development. I know that the business community has been unhappy with the legislation that was adopted by the council 2 years ago. And Councilmember Silverman has been working for the past year over issues related to the bill. There also came out of the Committee on Business and Economic Development, the Clean Hands Equity Amendment Act. I know that Councilmember Che has asked me to consider re-referring it to her committee because now it deals exclusively with driver's licenses. I haven't made a decision regarding that. The theory behind the legislation is that low-income individuals who are economically struggling with jobs, and the transportation, if they're driving, is critical to their having a job. And if they are unable to renew their driver's license because they have unpaid tickets, then they may lose their job. It's sort of like, I don't want to say it, putting a monetary penalty on poverty. I don't mean to say that in the way that I think light of that, because it's a very important problem that we need to look at. What the legislation would do is to exempt driver's licenses from the Clean Hands requirement, which is in the law that says that individuals cannot get licenses or permits of any kind from the district if they have unpaid debts, which would include tickets. Well, this bill would exclude tickets. So there may be some discussion regarding that legislation tomorrow. My sense is that the council is overwhelmingly in support of doing something that mitigates the tax on poverty, if you will. But I don't know if this bill has a complete consent at this point from members. There are a number of resolutions that are confirmations to the Food Policy Council, to the Green Finance Authority. The new Chief Financial Officer, Glenn Lee, is on the agenda for confirmation. It's only been 3 weeks since our last legislative meeting, but the mayor was able to send 20 contracts for approval. So those are on the agenda. I don't believe any of them are controversial. Although, as I said that, I'm remembering that there is one contract that's with Covanta Fairfax that Councilmember Che, I believe she's one who asked that this be on non-consent. This is to continue a contract that we have with Covanta Fairfax for burning trash. And there's been some controversy about that in the past. So that actually would be the 21st contract on tomorrow's agenda, along with 2 compensation agreements for approval, one of which is UDC compensation approval with a couple of unions, and a compensation agreement involving the Department of Behavioral Health. I don't think there's any controversy there. There's one measure that is a final reading that's on non-consent. It's a tax abatement for, it says Skyland Terrace here, Habitat Real Property. I don't think there's any controversy there. I'm only bringing this up in case any of you ask. I believe the issue is that there's an applicability date in the law that has to be changed. It's substantive, can't be done as a technical by general counsel. So I don't think there's any issue there. With regard to emergency legislation, and for the benefit of the public, may be watching, the emergency bills are bills that go into effect immediately if the mayor signs them, but are only valid for 90 days, typically accompanied by a temporary bill that has to go to the Hill, get 2 readings and go to the Hill. It's only in effect for 225 days. These bills don't go through the normal hearing process, and the ability for public comment is less. There are 7 that members have introduced, and probably the most noteworthy of them is medical marijuana self-certification. This is another effort at trying to help the medical cannabis industry. This bill, however, does not address the issue of the illegal operations. I call them pop-ups that somehow have managed to name themselves I-70 compliant, although the Initiative 70 didn't in any way. I-71 compliance, I misspoke, I-71, although the initiative didn't speak to their operation at all. So that's a misnomer to suggest that they're compliant with the initiative. They're not, they're illegal. We would like to be able to tax and regulate them. We are unable to because of a congressional rider. It creates a ridiculous situation in that individuals are allowed to possess small quantities of cannabis, as you know. Individuals are allowed to use cannabis on a recreational basis, that there's no criminal penalty or civil penalty associated with that, but it is not possible to buy or sell cannabis in the district on a recreational. And yet what we're seeing is a recreational, illegal black market recreational industry that is growing and estimated a couple of months ago being about $600 million. It's dominated, as far as we can tell, by out-of-state interests, although they contend otherwise, but that's because they're illegal and their ownership information is shady, if at all. And so if we don't get a handle on these pop-ups and the illegal recreational sales, what we're going to see is that the medical side, which is legal and is regulated, will continue to see a loss of its customers because their product is more expensive, because it's burdensome to participate in the legal medical market. And so they're at a disadvantage to the illegal businesses. And if the legal businesses go out of business, which some of them are struggling right now, then when the day comes that we are able to tax and regulate recreational, there will not be existing local businesses that can step in. And we've seen this in other states. In any event, emergency bill that would allow for customers to self-certify their medical need is what's on the agenda tomorrow. I expect it will pass. And Councilmember Lewis George has put on the agenda I'm going to say a modification that to the foreclosure moratorium that extends the deadline before foreclosures can resume. It extends it by about a month. The reasoning for this is that there's federal assistance available. The district, for reasons I don't understand, is one of the last states to actually begin to implement the program to get the federal dollars out the door. If I remember correctly, it's over $50 million that's available to homeowners who are struggling with to avoid foreclosure. That program just started last week. And so Councilmember Lewis George is proposing to extend the moratorium an additional month. I don't think there'll be an issue with whether the council approves that tomorrow. Councilmember Gray has an emergency that revises the law with regard to consent for vaccinations by minors. There was litigation over the bill that we adopted in 2020. And a U.S. District Court issued a preliminary injunction This legislation is revised to comply with the court, even though the court just still hasn't issued a final ruling in that case. And looking at the notice from Councilmember Gray, vaccine providers may provide a recommended vaccination to a minor where there's been a reasonable attempt to obtain consent from the minor's parent or legal guardian, either in person, in writing, or by telephone, and there's no objection from the parent or legal guardian. As well, vaccinations would be available to minors who are emancipated or otherwise independent. So those are revisions from a very blanket authorization for minors, which is what we had adopted in 2020. I want to note, because there's been some attention to this issue over the past week, I sent a letter to the mayor last Wednesday with regard to the RFK site. There's been an effort by the mayor for at least the last half a year to get legislation through Congress that would convey the RFK site to the district. The council was not included in these discussions until very recently. And a version of legislation that I saw, I think it was a few weeks ago, indicated that the conveyance, if Congress were to pass this legislation, would be at market value. Congresswoman Norton, who has been our warrior on the Hill, has made it clear that she's not going to introduce the legislation unless the council and the executive are in agreement. I was finally briefed by the mayor on this. I believe it was the week before the election, Thursday before the election. And the emphasis was that the mayor wants to acquire the site for housing and then attendant services. In fact, I don't think there was any reference to a stadium other than I might have brought it up and asked about it. So the letter that I sent indicated, based on my surveying of council members, that council members would support the district acquiring the property, Congress transferring the property to us, even if we have to pay for it, but not with a stadium. So that was what I put in the letter. The mayor asked to meet with me and Congresswoman Norton on Friday, which we did meet. The mayor's request was simply that I withdraw the condition regarding a stadium, but there's not support in the council for that. So my letter is unchanged in that regard. I'm not quite sure why there's attention to a stadium if a stadium is not the intent on the part of the mayor. And as I said, there's just not support in the council. So we will see it's pretty clear to me that legislation is unlikely to be introduced, or even if introduced, unlikely to get through the Congress if a stadium is a possibility. And there is speculation that with the Democratic Congress that we're more likely to get the land this year, which makes it somewhat urgent for legislation to be introduced in Congress. So our view is that we're on the same page with the mayor with regard to acquiring the land for housing, attendant services. And I would say at this point, it's up to the mayor whether she's going to insist on there being the ability for a stadium, in which case I'm not sure that there's any legislation. So that's just an update on that issue. With that, I'm happy to take any questions. I don't see any. I guess I can go home. Mr. Ostermeal.
This is unrelated to what's on the agenda for tomorrow. And in all honesty, is one of the lesser Supreme Court decisions from last week, but the one on guns. I know it's something you've been involved in over the years. Do you have any concerns that what the court ruled obviously isn't going to impact the district too severely, because you guys already adjusted the laws regarding how people can get concealed carry permits. But is there any part of the ruling that you're concerned about in terms of litigation regarding where people can carry guns in the district in the future? Because right now, obviously, as you know, it's very limited. I mean, you can't be on Metro, you can't be in government buildings, you can't be in stadiums, you can't be near protests. But do you think that could be chipped away at some point?
Well, I've not been briefed by our Attorney General on the Supreme Court decision, but my understanding is that the law has been pretty clear that property owners have the right to refuse somebody on their property who's carrying a gun. I could put that differently, that property owners have a right to prohibit guns on their property. That's their right. That would not be the government infringing the right to keep or bear arms. And having just said keep or bear arms reminds me that I just think it's unbelievable that the Supreme Court could argue that you can't just focus on the words keep arms, you have to focus on the words bear arms. Well, let's focus on the words a well-regulated militia, but they don't focus on those words. Be that as it may, the decision of the court, at least in general terms, is similar to a decision that was reached by a U.S. District Court judge regarding the district's law a few years ago, because our district's law was modeled after New York and Maryland's. And we had a very good legislative basis, citing congressional actions, limiting the right to carry back to before the Civil War. And the way the U.S. District Court dealt with it was to simply say that this was such a clear-cut constitutional right that there's no ability of the legislature to do anything to the contrary, and therefore the court didn't have to discuss our arguments or our reasoning. That's how the district court dealt with it in the district, which I thought was a bit authoritarian, if you will. We did not appeal that because we were afraid that if it went to the Supreme Court, we would get exactly the decision that the Supreme Court handed down last week. So we modified our law instead, and we took out that a person has to have a reason to carry. So the Supreme Court decision does not affect us in terms of our carry law. I don't believe, but I'll need to be briefed by our Attorney General, that it would affect an individual's right or a property owner's right to prohibit somebody from carrying on their property. So Metro would still be able to prohibit it. We would still be able to prohibit carrying in a government building. I think that the ruling was wrong, and I think we will see the consequences with increased bloodshed in this country. And at some point, as a society, we're going to have to reckon with the deaths and reconcile that as the beacon of democracy in this world, that we lead the world in gun violence.
And then following up on the other ruling regarding Roe v. Wade, I know that Councilmember Nadeau had some legislation about a month and a half ago that would have basically prohibited the district from cooperating with any state that is prosecuting a person or a provider. But that hasn't been voted on. Do you have any sense of where that is, or anything that the council could do with its limited authority to address what the
Yeah, there's several bills that are pending. One is to protect providers in the district from being prosecuted in another state, or to protect individuals who come here for an abortion from being prosecuted in another state. I would note one of the fundamental problems with the implication of the Supreme Court setting social policy here, which they ought not to be doing, is that statistically we see that more low-income folks seek abortions, and they will be disadvantaged by this because they will not have alternatives. The government's forcing them to have a child. And these are individuals are least likely to be able to afford to come to the district. But there is legislation that would protect them if they need to be protected. I expect that all those bills will go through the council this fall. They should go through a hearing process so that we're sure that we've got it right and that there are not any unintended loopholes in the legislation. I think there was another part to your question. Yeah, I think the legislation will move, but it's in various committees. It's not in the committee of the whole. So if it was, I would be moving it very quickly. Michael.
For the consent for vaccination of minors emergency declaration, can you just clarify what exactly is new or different in Councilmember Gray's proposal than what was originally proposed?
What we had adopted a couple of years ago, and that was enjoined by the court, was a very broad, any minor age 11 or older could obtain a vaccination. I think there was some counseling that was required. There had to be a doctor who had to vouch for the need and the safety. And the court said that that interfered with parents' rights. And so this bill adjusts for that and says that a parent has to be notified, parent can't object, unless I gave the example of the child is emancipated, in which case the child can make that decision on his or her own. So it's more limited. It's much more limited. Because I don't know how many children would be seeking a vaccination where their parents would be contacted and the parents would not object. That would not be getting vaccinated because the parents wanted them to get vaccinated. I think the universe will be very small.
And then I have an off-topic question just about a very violent weekend that we had in the district. I believe there was 4 killings since Friday. One of them was a teen who was on their way to college. Another was a 15-year-old boy. 16 shootings overall, 22 victims, 4 people dead. And the homicide count now we're at 104 compared to 86 this time last year. I feel like it's not the first time we've asked you about this, but you see these numbers and some of the ages of the people who are affected by gun violence. You know, what, as a lawmaker, as chair of the council, where are you at?
Well, I have argued in the past before the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council that there needs to be a better coordinated strategy between law enforcement agencies, that there needs to be a greater focus on known repeat violent offenders, and that there needs to be more resources that are put into solving cases. So, I mean, just think about it. Of the murders that took place this weekend, how many of them have been closed? Now, to be sure, it's only been a couple of days, but how many have been closed? They need to be closed quickly. They need to be closed, and they need to be closed quickly. The quick has the deterrent effect, and the closed has the effect of, based on probable cause, that known perpetrators are being gotten off the street. The estimates are several hundred individuals are responsible for the vast majority of violence in this city. And those are the folks that should be focused on. So we can do it. We, meaning the government, can do it, but there needs to be more focus, more resources on closing cases, and more coordination between agencies. Mr. Rice.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Juneteenth commission that is on the agenda?
I believe that legislation is subject to appropriation, so it would require funding. But the idea is that it would actually plan, give some meaning to the holiday. So it's not just a day off, but you know what I experienced this past, I'm hesitating week, was it only a week ago, with Juneteenth, was that there are some who are using the occasion to explore the legacy of racism in this country and to have a conversation about it. I think that's a good thing. maybe there ought to be more programming around that. Just as we have come to, in the district, to use Emancipation Day in April to talk about statehood. And there's been some programming around that. So that's the thinking.
Who appoints it?
I'd have to look at the legislation
Okay.
to tell you for sure, and I don't think I have that in front of me.
Go ahead.
Martin?
Just back to the medical marijuana stuff, I mean, self-certification seems relatively self-explanatory. The one thing that was brought up the last time you guys debated this as part of the broader bill to crack down on these I-71 compliant.
There is no such thing as.
I know,
I-71.
quote unquote, you didn't let me do the quote unquote. Was Councilmember McDuffie's amendment that would have just added more licenses to kind of try to bring some of these, again, quote unquote compliant vendors kind of into the legal market. Is that at all being considered, or is that just not something that's going to be brought up?
I don't believe that's on the agenda for tomorrow's emergency bill. The emergency bill speaks only to the self-certification, which is to make it easier. So right now, if an individual has a medical need for cannabis, I could put that a little differently, that an individual believes that cannabis can help them in terms of, let's say, anxiety or some physical issue. They have to apply for a medical cannabis permit. To do that, they have to go to a doctor first. They have to get a prescription. All this costs in time, it costs in energy, and it costs in money. Now, not that I would recommend this, but there's an illegal pop-up down the street. You can just walk in there and pay cash and you can get your drugs. Now, the quality isn't assured, and there may be some risks involved in this illegal cash operation, but it's a lot easier, and it may even be cheaper. It probably is cheaper. So I think that there's a lot to be offered with the medical cannabis industry, besides the fact that we know that they're local. They're local businesses. Several of them are minority owned. And they have to go through a regulatory process that ensures quality. There are also some variety, and variety matters if you have a medical issue, because you may want higher concentrations. I have to kind of look to staff of CBD, which is less about getting high. Variety is important. Quality. So there are things to be offered. There's less risk when you go into a licensed establishment. More variety, as I said, you're sure to the quality, and all that's to the good. But it's too hard on the individual. So the self-certification reduces those barriers considerably. What I did a couple months ago was to tie it to increased enforcement. And there was quite a bit of pushback there, which I think is unfortunate because it's exactly the problem we're trying to avoid, which is out-of-state interests. Do you think that all this marijuana that's coming into the city is locally grown, this illegal marijuana? No, it's coming here on trucks from other states. And who owns those trucks? Well, not some individual Joe. I mean, these are big organizations, out-of-state businesses, exactly what we don't want to dominate this market when we're finally able to regulate recreational marijuana. So the current situation is hurting the legal, medical, local businesses and is simply empowering, if you will, the illegal out-of-state operators. And unfortunately, they've been able to somehow convey the rhetoric, inaccurate, that these are just small local guys who are just running an illegal, an I-71 compliant store. Not true.
Well, then, I mean, again, why not just pass a standalone bill that expands the medical marijuana program, recognizing that, okay, it's not recreational, but it's become the de facto recreational option for people. Why not let more people get into that system? I mean, it's what Kenya McDuffie wanted to do. That didn't go anywhere because the bill failed altogether, but why not separate that out and just have that voted on?
Well, remember, we are living in the shadow of a congressional rider. A congressional rider that the Democratic Congress has been unwilling to or unable to remove. Any other questions? Nate, you look like you have a question.
Do you know what the Covanta contract asks?
It's a modification to an existing contract. And I'm looking for my notes right now. It retroactively approves an extension of the contract and provides an additional 6-month extension through the end of 2022. These extensions are necessary to ensure these critical services continue uninterrupted until viable alternatives can be considered. At this time, the district does not have a meaningful alternative to incineration. DPW recently released an assessment of district disposal options. I'm not sure there's more to add. I believe it looks like it's just an extension.
Thank you.
Have you given any thought to the predicted turnover of Congress, especially in the House, to Republicans, and how that will affect the district? People are in fact saying that the basic home rule law is possibly in jeopardy.
Well, you're not the first to ask the question. So yes, I've given thought to it, but it's difficult to strategize against something that hasn't happened yet. The district government, and I believe the citizens will be very much opposed to any erosion of home rule. But we have to see what it looks like. Absent a suggestion, I don't think there are any specific actions that we could take at this time for what, actions that we can take at this time should the House or the Senate turn over and against actions that haven't manifested themselves yet. So, but I will say this, yes, I've been asked a question, so there is the concern. People are talking about it, and I know there are a couple of strident Republicans on the Hill who've talked, I think, very inappropriately about getting rid of home rule. We've had Republican Congresses in the past, and we are still here as a home rule government. So I'm not going to preach or feed into the doom and gloom thinking. We'll just have to see what happens. I will add this as well. Anyone who looks back on the district pre-1974, pre-home rule, will see that Congress had an extensive operation to manage the district, and there was increasing awareness and acceptance in Congress that they didn't have the ability to manage the district as well as a local home rule government. We've seen the district, it's taken a few years, but we've seen the district thrive under home rule. For the Republican congressmen who've talked about getting rid of home rule, they haven't thought through what burden they would be putting on themselves, and it would be extensive. And I don't want to suggest for a moment that it would be acceptable to us. Just look at what we were talking about with our inability to regulate recreational cannabis. Congress has not shown the ability to manage affairs in the district on as limited a basis as they have tried, like cannabis. If there are no other questions, we start at 12 o'clock tomorrow. There'll be a legislative breakfast in the morning. As I like to say, it's a breakfast without breakfast, or the members can bring their own breakfast since it will be virtual. And the meeting will be at 12. I think we start with the committee of the whole, which will be simply to process bills that come out of the other committees, and then the legislative